Sorry, Ram fans, I couldn't resist starting off with a penalty flag coming at the end of a clock after last night's football game. We went through a little too much of that. It was a difficult loss. We're never happy with losses like that. It could have been played maybe a little bit better. And the Rams could have walked away with a victory. I'm not, I've got some buddies that are Norvell out kind of guys. I'm not a Norvell out person, so I'm not that way. I just don't believe in that. But I will give a little bit of a spiel about, there was some good stuff that happened yesterday, and but good is not good enough. It's important to try and be great. I actually heard Coach Medved out of practice last week give a similar speech to that, where he just looked at everybody at the end of practices. If you just want to be good, you'll be good. But if you want to be a great team, you got to strive to be great every day, every practice. And so I don't know if the football team, they've probably heard that before from their coaches, but it's just a nice message to keep reinforcing. So welcome to the Monday morning cup of coffee, a tradition with my blog and my podcast, and now YouTube. I've got my wonderful coffee here. I'll try and sip it. Got to stay awake, Anyway, welcome. First, I want to say thanks for everybody for what they've been doing in terms of the community. The views have gone up on my videos, and that's exciting to me. And a lot of it has to do with the quality of the guests I get. And I thought I had a great show last Thursday with Justin Michael of DNVR Rams and Josh the Zagaholic, Gonzaga fan. And I'm really excited to have the guest I have today, Jacob Schildgen. Jacob is a CSU graduate. I'll give a little more bio information about him, but the quality of my guests hopefully gets better and better over time. I think you're really going to enjoy this show, but it's important not just that you watch the videos, but if you can subscribe to Crackers College Hoops and hit the like button, it's really, really important to me. The other thing is, and I want to add, the past couple of shows I've talked about this being the Crackers College Hoops National Park Month. October is my month, and it has to do with the fact that political campaigns and advertising get pretty damn gross this month. I was watching football games on Friday night. The first game I was watching was, I think it was a televised game out of Texas, and I got to see a U.S. Senate ad for somebody from Texas. And then I watched the UNLV game later, and I got to see an ad for a U.S. Senate race in Nevada. And I'm not interested in that stuff. I have no desire. I just want to watch football. We get inundated with ads. I like to think that the best of America is found in our national parks. And tonight I'm using a photo sent in by our guest, Jacob Schildgen, who responded. And please send me, if you have photos you want me to use, crackerscollegehoops@gmail.com, and I'll use it for an October background. So without further ado, let's get to my guest. My guest is Jacob Schildgen. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Long time follower. I went back and I tried to find out when exactly I started following your work, and the earliest thing I could find was 2017, but I got to imagine it's probably several years before that. I think during those turning runs under Miles and Eustacia, I think I remember reading some of your posts on the blog. So been a long time follower and happy to be here.
You must have been a kid if you were following me that long ago.
Relatively, yeah. I was in college still, but.
So as I mentioned, Jake's a CSU graduated in 2014, and he spent time in the McElwain administration and beyond, working as an equipment manager for the football team. Also covered CSU for Mountain West Connection. Lived in Fort Collins, now lives in Castle Rock. Works for a corporate mergers and acquisitions for a publicly traded company. 2 daughters, 5 and 3. That's got to be a handful. You're lucky you have 2 daughters. Yeah. I have a son and a daughter. That's 2 daughters I would have loved. And a dog named partially after Kaipo Sabas. Tell me that story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Kaipo Sabas must have played at CSU in the early 2010s, right? It must have been like 2010 to 2013, and
I
that
think
was when I
2012. I think he was his last
okay.
year.
And that's when my wife and I we went to CSU together. You know, when we were students, we'd go to just about every sporting event there was, starting with volleyball. That's what first introduced us to Moby Arena, was that great volleyball team under you know, the Tom Hilbert. And so you know, we went to basketball games, and we loved watching Kaipo Sabas because, you know, he's a smaller guy, but, you know, played with a lot of heart. And so when we got a dog, we also love Hawaii, and Kaipo and Hawaiian means sweetheart. And so we thought it was a perfect mix of our two passions of traveling and CSU sports.
Well, that's obviously something we have in common. You know, my dogs are named
Yep.
after CSU basketball
Right.
players. My current one is Mookie, who's on the couch right next to me, sleeping quietly, after the nickname of Kendall Moore, who was here for 4 years. Before that, we had Ogie, who was named
Mhm.
after Andy Ogaday, who was here when during your years at CSU. Um, I wanted to talk about, you know, we got to know each other last year pretty well with some text interchange stuff, and it had to do with some really good advanced stats
Yep.
stuff that you were looking at. What is your what intrigued you just about putting together stuff advanced stats? Is it just your background in terms of some of the stuff you've done in business, or is it just something that you just love to do with sports?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I love basketball, but I never played organized basketball, and I don't have a great understanding of a lot of the X's and O's, and that's part of why I love, you know, reading along on your blog, because they have such great insight on, you know, what's actually happening behind the scenes, and you know, the strategy and tactics that are on the court. And so and in the other part of it, I don't, living in Castle Rock with two young kids, I don't get up to Moby Arena often to actually see games in person, and so, you know, like, you know, when you're at a game live, you get such a different feel for actually what's going on the court, and versus watching it over, you know, over a television screen. And then, you know, with my background in corporate finance and M&A, it's just natural talent for me to look at numbers. And so with the proliferation of all these great advanced analytics sites, whether it's, you know, really started with KenPom and Haslametrics and Bart Torvik and Nevamaya, there's plenty of great statistical analyses out there to be done. And so it's been kind of my way to connect with the program without being able to be up there and go to every game like I'd like to.
Well, one of the, you know, like I referred to, you know, some of the stuff we had going back and forth last year. You had done an analysis and was looking at why CSU's 3-point shooting was significantly lower on the road, and their
Yeah.
offensive efficiency was significantly lower on the road than it was at home. And it was some really good stuff. And someday we'll have to look. Maybe this year we'll look into that. We'll figure out a way to do a show and look into that maybe a little bit further. But it
Yeah.
started some really good interchange because I got involved. I got actually Ali Farouk involved and started sending stuff back and forth to him, and he started firing back. Well, maybe you should consider this, maybe you consider that. And I thought it was a wonderful dynamic about how kind of analytics can meet reality and
Mm-hmm.
allow you to build models that maybe look at things with a little more granularity, because it takes into fact you know, what's really going on the court. And what was really funny was the direction of what you were working on. Yeah, and you can talk about this some more, but the direction started looking at all of a sudden how all teams performed at elevation versus sea level, and maybe talk about that a little bit, because it was just real interesting. It's something we might have to go into in a future show.
Yeah, yeah. I'll have to brush it off a little bit, because I remember going back and forth probably in February of this year, when CSU was in that really tough rut in the middle of what ended up being a pretty great season. But yeah, it's just one of those things where, you know, you have a thesis, and you just want to test it. And like I said, there's multiple sites out there where you can get a lot of really interesting information. And so I had a theory that teams played better in Moby, CSU shot better in Moby, and we struggled away from home on the offensive end. And I think what I found is that not only did we play better at Moby, but our opponents played better at Moby as well. And you look like you look at a team like San Diego State, some of their best shooting performances were in Moby Arena over the past several years. And whether that's altitude or, we had talked about maybe it's just the way the gym's constructed where it's a shooter's gym because of the green background or something else. But it's just one of those things where it's, you do enough of these things and you uncover something that might be actually pretty interesting and insightful. And that's why I enjoy doing it.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a really fun interchange, and Ali was great because he was eating it up too. It was fun.
Sure.
So you talked about the models, the Ken Palms, and which has kind of been the leader in the business for a while. But then you referred to Torvik and Haslametrics. Any others that you look at?
I think Evan Maya is the other good one that I've come across fairly often. I think between those four, that pretty much covers it. By the middle of basketball season, if you go to my recent tabs on my phone, it's always those four sites just hopping back and forth, trying to see what's going on in the world of college basketball.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I keep about 4 tabs open on my iPad, and 3 of them are analytics sites. I'd like to go back and forth. Do you have a preference of one over another, or do you find that one works better for different stuff?
Yeah, it's hard to beat the open source nature of Torvik's site. I mean, you can do just about anything you want to do without any form of paywall. So I'm on Bart Torvik a lot, looking at team and player stats. I don't subscribe to KenPom. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting stuff you can do behind the paywall with KenPom. And I like Haslametrics a lot for their matchups that they do between two teams. So you could pick any 2 teams in college basketball, away, home, or neutral court, and they'll kind of line them up side by side. And I post a lot of those snapshots on my Twitter page because it's really immediately highlights kind of the things to pay attention to in any matchup.
I found I actually, I do pay for KenPom, and it's like $22 a year or something like that. And it gives you a little more, detail. You see a, kind of an overall ranking on the free part, and then get a little more detail. But I like the Bart Torvik stuff because I can do some sorts, and you can pick different dates. You can do so many different things with the data, and you really can't get at that level of granularity with KenPom. And then Haslametrics, there's some things he does some really, really interesting creative things, and I think he's more. To be honest with you, I haven't talked to him. I sent him an email to try and get him on the show to talk about the new changes that he's made to Haslametrics, but he's obviously big time in me. He's a little too big for me. But he's I think he loves to come up with best bets of the day kind of stuff, and he really looks at things from a little better from a gambling perspective. KenPom does get used by Vegas a lot for setting spreads, but I think Haslametrics really does a great job of quantifying things a little better for things where you might see a total score, a score prediction to the tenths or hundredths of a point, and best bets and things like that. And it's just kind of a really cool thing. And he's added some features. I'm going to talk about one of the features, this paper tiger factor, after we get through with your stuff. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of from the high level. Let's talk about, let's move to your stuff. You sent me a bunch of stuff, and every one of these topics to me is interesting because it really relates to what we're going to look and see with CSU in the coming year. So, oops, let's get back here. I'm sorry. I wanted to be there. Let's get rid of that background. Let's go there. A little better. So why don't you just kind of talk through the talking points, and then we'll go through them one by one.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, we'll kind of start by looking at it's kind of Christmas Eve for advanced analytics fans, because you've got Bart Torvik's preseason rankings, you've got Haslametrics preseason rankings. I'm sure KenPom will be out here probably in the next couple of weeks, but we'll look through what does that look like for the Mountain West teams and a couple notable out of conference opponents. And then it's the stats kind of line up with, I think, what we would expect from just an anecdotal side of things. There's a lot of players graduating, transferring out of the Mountain West this year. It's going to be quite a mix up with the top teams. And so a lot of the teams are looking like they're going to be down from the last season. And you've heard of that a lot on this podcast, on Tom Moser's podcast. There's a lot of churn. And so one of the things I wanted to look at is, what could we expect for in-season improvement over the preseason rankings, and I'll touch on that more. And then, looking at the 2024 CSU squad, they're not immune to that, right? It's going to be a fundamentally different roster without Isaiah Stevens leading the way, and our first chance to see that in 6 years. And we got a little taste of a post Isaiah Stevens world at the beginning of the 23 season when he was out with injury, and it wasn't great. And so, is it going to look like that, or is it going to look a little bit more like last season where we had a lot of pieces coming and going, and they were able to put together something pretty special. And then I think what a lot of fans like about the CSU offense is the scoring balance. And so look a little bit at that over the past couple of years. And if we look at the current roster makeup, who can we expect to take a role? And Bart Torvik's analytics have kind of taken a first shot at that. And then another analysis that I did last year that it dusted off just a little bit, it was this player development under Nico Medved and staff, which I think we all like to think that Nico is a premium coach in a league filled with other premium coaches. And so I wanted to see if the data supported that. I'll talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, all these topics, I'm familiar with the slides that we're about to go through. I think these are really, really fun topics. And I think people are going to have their eyes open with some of the level of detail that you provide. So let's get into it. Here we go. Preseason rankings, Haslametrics and Bart Torvik. Talk us through it, Jake.
Sure. Yeah. So you can see Haslam on the left and Torvik on the right. And, the first thing you'll see is there's a lot of red on the slide. A lot of teams in the Mountain West, from an analytical perspective, look like they're going to be worse from where they were at the end of the 2024 season. There's a couple improving mostly on the bottom side of the conference, but it'll be interesting. Take San Diego State for instance. That ranking of 77 on Bart Torvik is easily their worst. What Torvik calls their T rank, and in I think 6 years, that's the lowest it's been. And so it will be interesting to see. There's not a lot of churn in coaches. It's certainly not among the top 7 teams, but it'll be interesting to see what actually happens here in the Mountain West this year. A couple other things. I think CSU being at 75 on Haslam and 80 on Torvik, I think that actually is fairly impressive considering the amount of churn that the roster has had. That's a pretty good number where they've been relative to the last several years. And if you jump down to the bottom, I included a couple of the notable opponents from our non-conference schedule. And that CU number is just bright red. And so, with Tristan Da Silva and Cody Williams and other important pieces being gone.
Yeah, KJ Simpson also.
KJ Simpson, it's going to be a huge pivot point for Tad Boyle and company, and it'll be interesting to see how they respond. And one of the things that we're really going to have to pay attention to as the season goes on is CU is in the Big 12 now, as everybody knows, and right now Haslam and Torvik have them projected to be the last team in the Big 12, and so they'll certainly pick up a good lift in the analytics from playing tough games, and I'm sure they'll probably do fairly well in conference. But if they can't figure it out with a really revamped roster and start getting blown out, it will be interesting to see what that CSU road game at CU ends up being. It could end up being a landmine of a game.
Absolutely. Yeah, just a quick ad for tickets go on sale on Tuesday. It's a couple of, tomorrow, Tuesday, and for the CSU visit to Boulder. So I will be there getting my tickets, and I hope a lot of Ram fans do.
Yeah.
I thought one of the interesting things. So I thought it was great that you threw the kind of the notables of the non-conference. You saw the jump in Ole Miss. I did a preview of the non-conference schedule, and I basically called Ole Miss probably the top non-conference game, and you can see they're ranked pretty highly on Bart Torvik. They're going to be what looks like a quad one game at a neutral site, and Virginia Commonwealth looks like they could be something as well. The other thing I wanted to point out, which is really interesting, was the only team that there seemed to be a real consensus on in the Mountain West from both models was, in terms of a jump, was San Jose State. Our friend Timmy Miles going up a bunch. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact he's got one guy who returned from injury, Robert Vejola, a big man, a good rebounder, and that was one of the weaknesses of the team last year. But they have a brand new backcourt. They lost their backcourt last year. Alvaro Cardenas, who transferred to Boise State, Myron Amy Jr., I can't remember what school he went to, but they added two really good guards. A guy from UCLA who was a four-star player, and then they added a guy named Donovan Yap who began his career at UNLV, went to Fresno State, and then now is in his fifth year, and he's a good player. So I think they're getting a lot of credit for adding a pretty talented backcourt. So it'll be interesting to see if they make the move up the ladder. But the rest of the stuff seems to make sense. Have we talked enough about that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the outlook.
Standings. Just taking if you take the rankings for those two sites and compare them to what the 2024 Mountain West standings ended up being, amongst the top 7, there is a little bit of churn amongst those groups. I think that really the big thing is New Mexico going from their sixth place finish all the way up to they're the first toughest team on Bart Torvik. Now I think their Torvik ranking is I think 41. It's in the low 40s. But it will be interesting to see if New Mexico can really get to that next level. Richard Pitino's got a great group there. They've had to deal with some attrition and graduation and transfers. But can they take what they did through last season and get it to being at the top of the Mountain West? I think will be an interesting storyline to follow. And then I think Nevada and Boise State, pretty quiet, but should still be pretty solid programs this year. And we'll look a little bit at kind of what expectations for in-season improvement might be on the next slide. And then CSU still hanging out there in the top 7, moving up a spot over UNLV. But I expect, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I think between the 6 teams that you see, or the 7 teams that you see here, they're separated by, I think, something like 20 to 30 spots. It's really tight at this point, and it will be interesting to see, with the amount of turnover, what rosters can really put it together, and which ones might take some time to get there.
Yeah, it's funny. They all build their preseason outlooks using different factors, different weighting, and it's a little bit of an art, and there's a little bit of science as well. And it's kind of interesting because I think the next slide we have is kind of an in-season improvement with where teams started versus where they finish. Right? That's kind of what you use for data on this.
Yeah, so looking back at the last 3, and this is using just Bart Torvik, but I think we all like to think that the Mountain West does have a premium of coaches between our own Nika Medved and Brian Dutcher and Leon Rice, Richard Pitino, Steve Alford. I think we have a pretty great group of coaches, and if that's true, you would expect to see improvement in that T rank on Bart Torvik from the preseason ranking to the end. And what you generally see is actually that's pretty true. Now there's obviously a lot of different factors in here, primarily injuries, but you can see last year just about every team improved or stuck pretty close to where they were relative to their preseason ranking. And the two things, or a couple of things I think are really important to call out here is of the 7 teams that you see up here, the only ones that improved each year were Boise State and New Mexico. And so I think, Leon Rice, he does a good job of bringing in high major transfers, and he's got a really critical one in Cardenas, who I think that having a true point guard in that program might really unlock a lot of potential that they've struggled with for the last several years with kind of the glut of talent that they've had at the point guard spot. But in the job that Richard Pitino is doing in New Mexico, like I said, is they've improved each of the last 3 seasons. Can they get over that hump and get to the top of the conference this year? And really, you look at like a school like San Diego State, they've stayed consistently elite the last 3 years, and so starting the season, in the mid 40s to 70s, even on Torvik, will they, with a completely different roster, are they going to get back to that elite status, or are they going to have a little bit of a different year than they've had the last several years in the conference? And Utah State's been consistently great. I mean, if you look at where they've been, and some of the logos are hiding themselves here, but even last year with the amount of churn that they had with the coaching change and players, it's one of those programs that's just built really great from a foundational perspective. And, they sustain coaching changes better than probably any school in the country, I would imagine. I mean, they've gone over, they've gone through 3 in the last 5 years, I think.
Yeah, you had Tim Duryea, followed by Craig Smith, followed by Ryan Odom, followed by Danny Sprinkle, and now they have a new coach, Jared. What's his last name? I'm trying to remember his last name. Came from Youngstown State. Anyway, yeah, 3 straight years, 3 coaches. And again, a very new roster. I think they retained about 4 players from the previous season. It'll be interesting to see what happens there with the players that they brought in. The New Mexico thing is going to be really, really interesting, because I think we're going to see a very different kind of team at New Mexico as well. They were a little smaller last year with the backcourt with Jalen House and what's his name? Mashburn Jr. And Dent as a guy that was kind of had to defer to the older guys. And I think Dent's a hell of a player. I think you're going to see him explode. But he's going to be the small one, and he's built pretty well. They're bringing in some real physical players, and I think that's going to be they're going to look more like a Big Ten team than a Mountain West team this year. It'll be interesting to see there. San Diego State, we'll see. I don't know. They have some transfers, and they have, but they sure have lost a lot in the last couple of years from that team that went all the way to the championship game. So I'm dying to see what happens there. So anyway, let's move on. I think CSU post Isaiah Stevens. Everybody wants to hear your thoughts on this.
I don't think, and I doubt anybody really is doing this, but I don't think we cannot underestimate how much of an impact he obviously had on the program. I mean, just from a numeric perspective, if you look at the top table there, over his 5 seasons in the program, his share of CSU's points and assists each year, I mean, that's a tremendous amount of production that it's going to be impossible to replace with one player. And I think his impact goes far beyond even just the numbers. Obviously, I mean, leadership and other soft qualities, but also, his ability to hit clutch shots that is really differentiated when you look at a lot of the other leading scorers in the conference. There's not a lot of players who can do that at the degree he was doing. And I think if you look at the roster, I don't know if there's anybody who's going to be able to step up and fill that void. But, it's other things that he did so well too. And, one of the things that's been really fun to watch about this program over the past couple of years is how deadly this offense has been from 2-point range, and primarily, right around the rim. They do a great job getting open looks. Obviously, when you have 5, really deadly ball handlers on the floor all together at the same time, you can do a lot of interesting things and interesting sets and get different players open. And so if you look at over the past 3 years, their 2-point shooting rank, it's been 14th, 14th, and 9th. And a lot of that is people like Joel Scott and Patrick Cartier and Josiah Strong and Jalen Lake and others. But, a big part of it was obviously Isaiah. And one of the things that will be interesting to watch is Isaiah had a trick in his bag that not a lot of players have or use anymore, and that's his mid-range game. And he took a tremendous amount of mid-range twos, and he made a tremendous amount of them. And that does two things. One, obviously you score, which is great. But also when you're that effective and efficient with those mid-range twos, it draws the defense out to you, right? And so I'm interested to see if you just look at the numbers for that on Bart Torvik's side, it's called a FAR 2. It's a 2 taken from outside the paint. With Stevens in the game, they shot, over 40%, upwards of 44% over the past 3 years. And if you take them out, it's a roughly 2 to 4 point change in this shooting percentage from that distance. And so it's just one of the things that we'll be interested to see, with different personnel, how much Medved and company change up the offense, because they won't have that kind of mid-range shot making capability, I think. But it's all those little things that you don't necessarily see just looking at the numbers that certainly have an impact on how opponents game plan and scheme for you.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to me. The thing with Isaiah, the top row, the whole idea of the point percentage of points and assists, go back to the year where they struggled, and it was 65%. He was involved with 65% of what was going on. Yep. And if you put a surrounding cast around him, the numbers went down and the team got better. And so, it's going to be interesting to see this year what the surrounding cast is like without him. They won't have anybody who can, I think of it as kind of one of these things where you've got guys that learned how to share the ball really, really well with Isaiah around, because he was your best player, but he shared the ball better than anybody else as well. And it becomes contagious. And it's going to be interesting to see this season. I think one of the great steps that was made last year was by Nick Clifford, whose assist rate really went up. And he had told me when he came to the program that he really was excited because he thought he could showcase his ability to pass the ball. He didn't get a chance to really do that much at CU, and getting involved with Nico's offense, the passing really came to the forefront. And he had a lot of games where he had 5 or 6 assists, and he was in a kind of a secondary role to Isaiah, but still very, very important in terms of sharing the ball. But it will be interesting to see what happens this coming year. So anyway, Anything else you want to say about this?
No, yeah, it will be really interesting to see Nick Clifford in a post Isaiah Stevens world, how much ownership and usage he takes on offensive possessions. If he's ready to step into that facilitator role a little bit more, or if they find a way to keep the ball moving around and utilize a lot of the other faces that are on the offense. I mean, you certainly have a couple pretty great guards coming into the program with Keyshawn Williams and Bowen Bourne, and you got Jalen Lake already, and it sounds like Ethan Warren might be facilitating from the point position as well. But it'll be interesting to see if Nick plays a similar role that he had last year, and he hopefully plays it at an even higher level, or if he changes his game a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny. I did ask Nico a little while ago, and I said, "Do you see Nick being maybe a little more of a facilitator? And he said, probably not. He said, I think I need him to score. It's like,
Sure.
they're a little worried that they're going to have trouble replacing Isaiah scoring. So he's going to look for Neek maybe to take a few more shots every game, and maybe instead of 12 points a game, maybe moving up more into the 16 point a game kind of territory. So okay, let's move on. Let's talk the next one, scoring balance.
Yeah, it's a good segue, because you look at the bottom there, that's points per game over the past 3 seasons, and that 16 points a game you just mentioned, you pulled out of the air there. That's what Isaiah averaged last year, right? So if you look at the roster, who's going to replicate that amount of scoring, because you can share the load to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, you have to have somebody to go to, I think, in these clutch moments. And another fun part about this offense and Nico's program is how balanced it is. And so you look over the past 3 years, each of those years you've had at least 6 players averaging 5+ points a game. And so it makes it really tough to game plan for when you can get some buckets out of just about every spot on the floor. And if you look at the projected contributors on the right, that chart's from Bart Torvik, and it shows one of the key metrics on that side is that 4th column in PRPG exclamation point. That stands for Porkag Atu, which essentially just looks at what is that the points that player is providing over a replacement player at that usage. Because if you ignore usage, you can have a lot of really efficient players that play a couple minutes here and there every game, but not everybody can come in and put the kind of minutes that Isaiah or Neek or other high performers do on the floor and still keep that efficiency. So if you look at that column, he's projecting Neek to be the most impactful player on CSU's roster, followed by Bowen Bourne, Jalen Lake, Keyshawn Williams, and then Ethan Morin. And then the third column from the right has the points per game. And so you see a pretty similar split on the scoring balance. You've got Bowen Bourne in almost that 16 points per game range, and then pretty evenly distributed between Neek and Jalen and Keyshawn, Ethan Morin, and JCJ. And so I think, looking at this, my mind is, who's gonna perform better than what the analytics are assuming. And what a fascinating storyline it will be for Ethan Morin. What he's projected to do there, being essentially projected the 5th most efficient player on the team, averaging just over 6 points. I think there's a real chance that he could be that Neek Clifford story of this year, right? The player that was on a high-powered Division I team, even more so in his case, being on powerhouse Purdue, but kind of tailing off in the last couple of years due to incoming players and offense going away from him. Does he have the chance to come in, completely revitalize his game with his last year that he's got here? And so that's a good example of a player where, if he performs better than his preseason baseline, that's where you can get that in-season improvement that we were looking at a couple slides back. But on the other hand, we also had a player like Javonte Johnson last year, right, where he actually, I think, analytically was better than Neek at his time at UNM, and obviously didn't go that way when he joined CSU.
Yeah, as for Ethan Morton, the one thing I think he's going to benefit from, he's not a 3-point shooter. He started his 3rd year at Purdue. They were ranked in the top 5 pretty much the whole year. They lost in the first round of the NCAAs, but they were a 1 seed, and he was starting. But their team is built around getting the ball to a 7'3" post player in the paint, and there's not a lot of room. And CSU plays more of a 5-out where the bigs, the paint is wide open and everybody's ducking into the paint. and I think it'll lend itself a little better to what his skills are. He's a good ball handler. He's solid getting to the rim. He's solid in the mid range. He's a good passer, good rebounder. And so I think you're dead on that I think there's some opportunities. I don't know if it'll be quite like Neek in terms of he's maybe not as athletic as Neek and maybe not quite as good a 3-point shooter, but I think you'll see some of the characteristics that you referred to when you compared him to Neek. The other one, though, that I think is going to be really interesting is they really undervalued Jalen Crocker Johnson and kind of the minutes and projected contribution. I think you're going to see a pretty significant contribution from him. I think he's a very good scorer, very athletic guy. He can shoot threes. He'll shoot them better than Joel Scott did. Good rebounder, good defender, runs the floor really well. And so I think you'll see maybe a little more out of him. And the question is, who does that going to take away from? And I don't know. I just don't know. It's really hard for me to get a handle on how the guards are going to all the minutes, how they're going to contribute in such a way that you're going to see that many out of Bourne, that many out of Lake, that many out of Keyshawn Williams. I don't know. It's going to be an interesting year seeing how the minutes split up amongst those people. So yeah, we'll see. But it's such an interesting thing because CSU depends on having 5 guys who can shoot. You're going to see maybe a little better. We lose Isaiah, obviously, but you're going to see, I think, a chance to have a pretty good 3-point shooting team. And then the other thing that's going to be really interesting about the contributors is Nick Clifford mentioned to me he thinks they're going to be a very good rebounding team this year, better than last year. And they had some pretty good guys with Scott and Cartier, but he thinks with Mbemba, Crocker Johnson, and then Kyle Jorgensen, and even Nikola Joppa with Neek rebounding as well, and Morton, he thinks they're going to be a really good rebounding team. But that'll be an interesting side story as well. So,
yeah.
Anything else on this projected contributors?
No, and that's the fun thing about college basketball is when you turn over the roster because players graduate college, it's fun to see, how all these pieces fit together that come from different backgrounds, different programs, different skill sets, and how do you balance it? Medved and company did a really excellent job of it last year. They'll have probably more of a challenge this year.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That's the joy of me watching college basketball is the turnover. I like seeing fresh and new. And somebody asked me after Isaiah finished his 4th year, are you excited to have him come back for a 5th year? And my answer was, well, I love having the kid around, but I kind of like new teams. I like to move on, and having 5-year players is such a luxury. But we're going to go back to having 4-year players unless they change the rules, which they've talked about doing. But to me, that's kind of the joy of watching college basketball, is watching players come in out of high school, developing over 4 years, and then and watching teams they're basically essentially new every year. That's the difference between the college game and the NBA, and that to me is a thrill. So speaking of teams developing, let's move on. This is a topic I think people are going to love to see. This is fun. When I saw this, I said, "Holy moly, this is really interesting stuff." Why don't you walk us through this, Jake?
Yeah, and like I said, I did this I think a year ago and I haven't refreshed it fully for the league, and I didn't even do it for every program. I picked the coaches you could see at the bottom there, and obviously Hudson's no longer at Fresno State, but again, it's I had a theory. I think we all do that Medved is the best coach in the Mountain West, and certainly seems like he's the best. He and his coaching staff are the best at developing players and getting the best out of their players. And so I wanted to see, is there data that supports that? And so using that PORPAG metric on Bartorvik's site, I looked at, if we take all the players that have come through the program and line those up over time, what kind of trends can we see? And, at the end of the day, these are all numbers, and so you can't draw anything definitive from them. But if you look at the really dark concentrations of green, you look at players like Isaiah Stevens and David Roddy, obviously, who, were not highly recruited players who went on to be extremely effective in CSU's system. And, back when I did this analysis, if you stack that up for each of the programs at the bottom, what I found was that the data, for the most part, aligns with that hypothesis that Medved and his team do have a differentiated ability to develop players, specifically out of high school. You look at Leon Rice and Brian Dutcher; they also do a good job of developing players, but their MO is a little bit more on bringing in Division I transfers from decent programs and continuing to have them perform at a high level, where I think CSU, and what you don't even capture here is the Division II transfers, right? Like Cartier and Scott, where you don't have a baseline of their efficiency in the D2 level, but to have them join and be able to perform at a high level, I think is extremely impressive. And so when we think about if you go back to that last slide and looking at the projected contributors, if you try to marry up those two trends of who's going to potentially outperform what the analytics have as a baseline, I think really the questions are, do you see huge jumps for Kyan Evans and Rashawn Mbemba like you saw for Stevens and Roddy from their freshman to sophomore campaigns? Will Ethan Morton be a Nick Clifford, or will he be a Javante Johnson? And I don't have Johnson on here because he ended up playing less than 10% of minutes this year, but and then of the freshmen that are coming on campus, do any of them have the potential to have an initial season like Stevens or Roddy had? And I think that one's probably less likely. Stevens and Roddy ended up being two of the best players to obviously ever come through Fort Collins, but could they have a season like maybe a Deshaun Thomas of contributing at a pretty decent level with a fair amount of time spent on the floor? So those were one of those fun analytics that we had talked about, that I just like there's so much data out there. I just like to put it together and see if it tells a story. And I think in the case of this one, it kind of does.
Well, it's interesting. You talked about Deshaun, and you look at some of the other players that maybe, Isaiah and David sure had a little bit of advantage. They got a lot of minutes and got thrown into the fire. And a lot of it was the fact that Nico was just starting to build a program. Now he has a kind of an ongoing self-sustaining program. And so the freshmen coming in, the minutes aren't quite as they're not there. You will see some freshmen playing this year, but you go back to people like Deshaun Thomas and John Tonje, maybe little smaller roles, but starting to play them and then watching them over time. And then Rivera as well, Isaiah Rivera, who came in the next year and played a little bit and then gradually built in. And I thought that the really interesting part about this model that you built was it wasn't Roddy and Stevens necessarily that were the ones that were developed. They weren't the only ones developing. You had the Thomases, you had the Tanjes, and the Riveras, who really made really significant leaps, and over their careers. And of course, we're going to watch John in the Big Ten at Wisconsin this year, and Isaiah Rivera will be playing in the Big East this year with DePaul. So it'll be fun watching them to see how much they grow in those programs. The other one that, of course, you talked about Ethan Morton. Will he be a Clifford or a Javante Johnson? The leap by Clifford was amazing. So
completely different player than his last year at CU, right? And that's a extreme testament to this program to be able to, first identify those players. If you looked at Neek's stat line at CU, and you were looking at it on a blank sheet, you didn't know who it was. It's not really an appealing profile for somebody you want to bring in, but to see that there was potential there that needed to be unlocked. And And thankfully, they have such a great system to do that with players. And then one other thing too, we haven't talked about Jalen Lake much, but I think you talked about this on your last show. He was trending so well at the beginning of last season, and then got derailed by injury after he put on almost an all-time CSU performance at home against the Buffs. But I really hope that this last year in the program he gets to find that next level, because I think he's got it, and I think he can get there, and he'll be very impactful if he can this year.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think he's a guy that's going to hunt a lot of shots, but I think if he's open, he'll take the shots, and I think he'll make a few more this year. So, the other thing though, I wanted to bring up, on the coaching, we have the coaching table on the bottom, and obviously, showing the jumps with Nico, with Rice. It looks like there's an old expression, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. But what's really interesting was I saw Justin Hutson, that actually, they've been terrible at Fresno State. But if you look at his starting point versus where those players ended up, he's actually done pretty well developing players. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I'll have to brush it off and go look at what exactly happened with the Hudson campaign at Fresno State. I think probably what the data would show, I think, is that he had too high concentration at the top. I think he had a couple really good players over the years, but I don't think he had quite as rounded out of a roster as some of these other coaches had.
Yeah, but it was a little eye opening, and of course, you see the job Alford has done at Nevada. He's really good at. They bring in players from they bring in transfers. He's done a good job with transfers. He's also done a good job developing preps. He's got Nick Davidson now.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I thought it was kind of cool. When you're a high school kid looking at this and you go, I always wonder when they talk to recruits and you get these recruits that light up and want to go to bigger programs and then sit on the bench for 2 years. You may be better off going to what's perceived as a quote lower program, and getting minutes and being developed. And that's one thing that, a recruiting pitch for Nico, obviously, but it's been very true throughout a lot of the teams in the Mountain West, and it's what's built the Mountain West, not just the transfers, but the player development that goes on. So I thought this was eye opening. I thought it was great. So anyway, thanks. Anything else you want to add, Jake?
No, that was all this material that I put together in advance, but it will, like we talked about, the fun is that we get to see how this all works out live here on the court in a couple of months. And, the fun part will be CSU isn't the only one going through it this year. Boise will have some changes with Max Rice going out and Cardenas coming in. And, I think, like I said, I think that could really take that program to another level. I'm interested to see if that's true. And, can San Diego State keep that elite train rolling with, one of their larger roster turnovers in a while. So there's a lot of great storylines. I'm excited to see how it all plays out. And, hopefully at the end of the season, we can look back and have 3 or 4 bids again this year.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I want to do my stuff now. This is something that I told you about. This is a brand new stat from Haslametrics, and it's something that it's kind of near and dear to my heart as you look at teams over the course of a year. He's done something called the paper tiger factor, called the PTF, and it's a measure of a team's ability to play to their level of competition. And so you've got a whole scale of positive and negative values. The positive values indicate teams that perform better against superior competition. The negative values indicate teams that perform better against lesser competition. And, I haven't had a chance. I wish I talked to him a little bit, but not much, Haslam, about this metric. I would love to know. I think the ideal would be you want to be zero. You want to be you don't want to have a positive or a negative value when you're talking about who you're playing. You want to perform consistently over every game you play. But you think of the positive values. Playing better against good competition, maybe not playing as well. You hear the expression sometimes we play down to our competition. That can happen. I also think there's maybe coaches that don't necessarily get their teams as up for the big games, and therefore they're just happy to win, whereas other teams maybe want to do a little more in terms of smashing them and winning by a lot. And of course, when you talk about the metrics, these teams that perform better against lesser competitors, they can still end up doing really, really well in the metrics. They may be poor, they may lose to good teams, but they can build up resumes by beating bad teams by 25 points. So I wanted to show you what the PTF was like for the Mountain West in 23-24. And there were only two teams that were positive, meaning these are the teams that tended to perform better against good teams. UNLV at the top. UNLV had an interesting year last year. They were really good. If you watch them, they were really good, but they had so many horrible losses on their resume. And they played bad teams bad. And, a 30-point loss to Air Force. They lost to Southern University. They lost at home to Loyola Marymount. All kinds of crazy losses, but then wins over Creighton, wins at Boise State, wins at New Mexico. They had some great wins. So that, by the way, that value at 2.97, number one in the country last year, which is amazing. They were the best team in terms of playing against better competition, elevating their game. CSU was actually about 17th at 1.40. Then you go down through the list: Air Force, San Diego State, Wyoming, Utah State. But if you go to the right side, you see the Boise State. Boise State was near the bottom in terms of this. They did a great job in terms of, they lost to good teams. They didn't necessarily elevate their game against good teams, but they built their resume by beating up on bad teams, and they did very, very well with that. New Mexico, Nevada, San Jose State over there as well. But, the other thing I looked at, and I think what Haslam is heading toward with this is, he can describe, what he calls them paper tigers. If you have a large negative value, you are a paper tiger. And the one interesting thing about this is I started looking at all the data, and I don't have the charts on this, but go to the left side of the column. So there were 7 teams in the Mountain West that made the postseason, 6 in the NCAAs and 1 in the NIT. UNLV played in the NIT. They won 2 games. CSU played in the NCAA, won 1 game. San Diego State won 2 games in the NCAAs. Yeah. Utah State won 1 game in the NCAAs. Those are the top 4 in terms of this metric from the Mountain West. The other 3 near the bottom, more the bottom, Boise State, New Mexico, and Nevada, all lost their first games. And it was really, and I think that's where he's headed with this stat, what he calls it the paper tiger. These are teams that build resumes by beating up on bad teams. And
another notable team just below Boise State on that list is the University of Virginia. And
I saw that. I was going to bring that up. There were 4 teams. So 4 teams that were near the bottom were Boise State, University of Virginia, Baylor, and BYU. BYU went as a 6 seed and lost to an 11 seed in the first round. Baylor was a 3 seed and won their first round against Colgate or something, and then lost to a 6 seed. Boise State went out, and Virginia, we saw what Virginia did. So it was really interesting. But that's I think that's what this metric is being developed for. And I found it really, really interesting. I'm gonna follow it. It allows you to really talk about teams and how they built their resumes, I think. So I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, these are the kind of great tools when you're filling out a bracket when we get to March to understand. Boise State, I think, was in the 30s in a lot of the advanced analytics on KenPom and others. So they were up there, but they had, to your point, they had cut that resume on a lot of bad teams, both out of conference and in conference. And, it's just another data point that you can use to try to estimate where you think matchups are going to go when you're, either looking at, who CSU is going to face, or when you're trying to fill out a bracket or place your gambling bets.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought it was I thought it was fascinating. So I'm glad he did it. I always talk about it as I remember I think I sent him a note a while ago. I said, you need to develop a new stat called Smash Factor, and it talks about teams that are really good about smashing bad teams, and that's how they build their resumes. And Boise State, I've heard Leon Rice actually even talk about how important it is to beat the bad teams by a lot. And there's others that have talked about it. He's not the only one, but they recognize the metrics favor performances like that. Unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate. I don't think winning gets valued enough. And I think, the one thing that I've always talked about with CSU that makes it really, really tricky is when Air Force is not really good and when Wyoming is not very good, those games are still hard for CSU because those are rivalry games. And no one, Boise doesn't have a rivalry game like that. San Diego State doesn't have a rivalry game like that. The only, to be honest with you, the only real rivalry in the Mountain West, other than what CSU has, is Nevada and UNLV. Everything else is everybody doesn't like each other, but they don't have quite the level that a CSU Wyoming game has. And so when one of those teams is down, it makes that game still very, very hard. And I don't think other teams have to deal with that.
Look how brutal those performances were last year with the Wyoming road loss and the 9-point win against Air Force. Those matter. And it's tough when those opponents get off the mat for a rivalry game.
Well, that was what was interesting about CSU's resume was that's what if you look at how close it was to them not making the tournament, that's what would have kept them out. Their performance against the top teams was better than any team in the Mountain West. If you look at the top 50 or top 100 teams, CSU was the best team in the Mountain West in terms of their analytics. But like I said, they almost fell off. So anyway, anything else you want to add, Jake?
No, I'm glad we got through an hour, and I know you opened with CSU football. I'm glad I didn't have to talk to CSU football. So
yeah, I'm unfortunately I'm not real big on what's been going on, but I'm not gonna beat a dead horse. I think everybody is a little bit disappointed in what's going on. So anyway, I want to bring up a couple of things. Number one, as we get further down the season, what I'd love to do is have you back maybe for kind of a regular weekly 5 or 10 minutes based on if we can get questions and comments from people on the videos on YouTube, or even if they contact us via Twitter, and maybe bring you on and maybe a question a week of what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And I want this to become more interactive, and I'd love to bring you on for that. The other thing is I'm going to be doing post-game, trying to live post-game shows after I go to the games. And I want to bring people on that either attended the game or watched the game on TV that can talk intelligently about what they saw. And I would love to have you appear every once in a while and pop in to talk post game. It may be late and it may be tough. I know you have 2 young kids, but I would love to have you on for that. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's an open offer. Hopefully you'll be able to make that work.
Yeah, well, I'll be looking at the analytics either way. So if people send in questions and we want to talk through some stuff, that's great. If not, I'm still going to be looking at them.
So super. Thanks a lot. I appreciate you taking the time. Hope everybody enjoyed their Monday cup of coffee. And as always, we're going to end with the CSU fight song.
Go Rams.
Go Rams.